when thinking about the function of the cardiovascular system in terms of providing the fuels we need for exercise, we've got to think about some key terms that really give us an insight on how well the system's working. Blood pressure is one we'll cover very, very quickly, because we do see a response, but it doesn't always tell us what we need to know. Blood pressure is, by definition, sort of the pressure applied to the walls of the arteries by the blood during the cardiac cycle. And it's split into two sections: systolic pressure, so that's pressure whilst the heart is contracting, and diastolic pressure, which is pressure when the heart is relaxing. So that gives you the nice double numbers we see. So, for example, 120/80 being the standard accepted healthy blood pressure, 120 being the pressure whilst the heart contracts, 80 being it while it relaxes. During exercise, different patterns depending upon the type of exercise. As we begin to exercise, we'll tend to see systolic pressure go up because the heart's working a little bit harder. During resistance exercise, we tend to see both systolic and diastolic pressure go up, because not just the heart working harder, but also the compression of the blood vessels by the working muscles causes big increases in pressure. The bigger the exercise, the bigger the amount of muscles used, the bigger the compression, and therefore the bigger resultant blood pressure we get. Of more interest, we've got heart rate. So that is the number of cardiac cycles occurring per minute, recorded in beats per minute. Again, as we exercise, we see that go up. We have stroke volume, the volume of blood being pumped by the left ventricle per beat. And then we have cardiac output, sometimes summarised as Q. So cardiac output being the sum of heart rate and stroke volume. So that becomes the total amount of blood pumped out by the heart per minute. Cardiac output being the primary indicator of cardiac function, really. So the reasons those things change during exercise, we'll think particularly about heart rate and stroke volume, because it changes in either of those result in changes in cardiac output. Changes in both of them result in a much bigger change in cardiac output, which is beneficial for exercise, because that means we are delivering more oxygen to the systems, removing more waste products at the same time. So heart rate, first of all, as we know, the heart generates its own nervous impulse, so it creates its own sort of contraction. However, our central nervous system can stimulate the heart to beat more frequently. So this comes down to neural and hormonal factors. We have feedback mechanisms in terms of proprioceptors, mechanoreceptors that are feeding back to the central nervous system about movements of the body. We've got chemoreceptors in the bloodstream feeding back about changes in partial pressures of gases, so an increase in carbon dioxide, a decrease in oxygen, and also changes in pH coming about as increased hydrogen ions are causing us to become more acidic. The heart recognises this as a need to stimulate the cardiovascular system to work harder, and so cardiac accelerator nerves reach out to the heart and cause that sinoatrial node to create more frequent impulses, so heart rate goes up. This is part of the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system being the branch of the autonomic nervous system that deals with fight or flight, so it speeds everything up. When we return to rest after exercise, the parasympathetic nervous system will tell the sinoatrial node to slow back down. Stroke volume then is controlled via two main mechanisms. We've got changes in preload and changes in contractility. Preload being how much blood gets into the heart during the rest periods, and that makes use of something called Starling's law of the heart. Starling's law specifies that the bigger the stretch of the ventricle, the harder the contraction, and therefore the bigger stroke volume. So if we can get more blood back into the heart, it stretches those fibres out even further. Those fibres will then contract more forcefully and we'll get a bigger stroke volume. The good news is the process of exercise itself will cause a bigger preload. As we are working, the muscular pump will force more blood back through the veins, back into the heart, which causes them to stretch the ventricle out and the bigger contraction. And then as we get a bigger stroke volume each time, that results in even more blood coming back around the system and back into the heart. So self-propagating in that respect, up to a certain limit. The other change we get in terms of increasing stroke volume is in contractility of the heart. So that's the strength of any given contraction of the ventricles. So this again comes down to the action of the sympathetic nervous system. The fight or flight mechanism causes release of catecholamine hormones, adrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and they stimulate systems to work harder. Specific to the heart, those hormones cause a bigger influx of calcium ions into the cardiac muscle. Calcium ions, if we remember back to anatomy in semester 1, calcium ions are crucial to the stimulation of contraction. So the bigger the influx of calcium, the more cross-bridge formation and the more forceful the contraction is. And a more forceful contraction will force even more blood out of the ventricle, so resulting in a bigger stroke volume. So this means that during exercise, we will get a big increase in heart rate, we will get a big increase in stroke volume, giving us a massive increase in cardiac output.